Hello, and welcome to the Wetland Professional Practice Standards webinar hosted by Soundtech. Thanks to everybody for coming in particular, thanks to our panelists for sharing their time and knowledge with the group. Don't worry if you didn't get a chance to see the entire presentation in the waiting room. We're going to cover that same material a little more briefly right here at the beginning of the webinar, and then we'll jump into our great panel discussion. So my name is Amy Griffiths. I'm an instructor for Soundtech, and I'll be your moderator for today. Our panelists are Dr. Marcus Thorman, who is a professional wetland scientist and a professional biologist, and represented the Alberta Society of Professional Biologists in creating these standards. Tom Snedden is a professional geologist and represented the Association of Professional Engineers and Geoscientists of Alberta. Noel St. Jean, who is currently retired, but represented the College of Alberta Professional Foresters, and Laurie Hamilton, who is a certified engineering technologist and professional biologist who represented the Association of Engineering and Geoscience Technology Professionals of Alberta. If you're having any technical issues, please put a comment in the chat and we'll try to support you through that. Okay. I'd like to begin by just acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we're on today. Though we're meeting online, I'd like to take a moment to just acknowledge the importance of the land that we each call home. As we're presenting this webinar from the traditional territories of the Treaty 7 nations of Southern Alberta, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, including the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai Nations, the Tsuut'ina Nation, the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, Goodstoney First Nations. And this area is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3, within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. We acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis and Inuit who have lived in and cared for these lands for generations. We're grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and elders who are still with us today and those who have gone before us. All right, so just a quick run through of the objectives of this webinar. So through feedback from its students, Soundtech instructors noticed a gap in the understanding of the wetland professional practice standards. So Soundtech thought it would be a good idea to hear from the authors of these standards, to hear about their experiences with its development and perhaps how it's being implemented under the Alberta wetland policy. So this short presentation will help just set up the panel discussion, provide regulatory context, identify which legislation drives the use of those standards, a little bit on the origin story of the practice standards, the scope of the Competency Advisory Group, who are the authors of the practice standards, talk about the responsibilities of the various parties that are outlined in the standards, and talk about how the standards are applied. As well as we're going to speak a little bit about the requirements for being an authenticating wetland professional and the competencies for conducting wetland policy tasks. So just a little bit more housekeeping before we get started. Any opinions presented during the webinar don't necessarily reflect those of Soundtech. And due to the volume of attendees, we won't have you ask your question directly, but please type it in the chat window. The webinar will end at 1 p.m., but the recording will be available afterwards, so you can check back on the webinar webpage for more details. So if you just have the producer add the link to the webinar website in the chat, please. Okay, a little bit of regulatory context. On the screen, you can see an overview of the multiple different ways in which Alberta wetlands can be managed. The professional practice standards are found under the wetland policy, which itself is a standard under the Water Act. The wetland policy was published in 2013, and the practice standards were published in 2017 as part of the wetland policy implementation. Okay, origin story of the practice standards. We're going to do a couple of polls as well throughout the webinar. So this first one is just kind of getting to know you and just so that the panelists have a sense of who the audience is today and can tweak their answers a little bit accordingly. These practice standards were a collaboration of 10 professional regulatory organizations, also known as the Pro-10, that the provincial government identified as working in the practice of wetland science, engineering, and design. The Pro-10 are shown on the front of the standard, and the idea was that this practice was very multidisciplinary and highly technical, so an overarching set of standards would be required to make sure that the due diligence happened across all professionals working on wetland management in Alberta, and that it would unify the practice. The professional practice standards can be found on the EPA Wetland Policy Implementation website. Okay, so Competency Advisory Group, or the authors of the standard. So the government of Alberta formed a group that represented the Pro 10 from a technical point of view, and they called that the Competency Advisory Group. In 2016, 12 professionals, which represented 10 different organizations, set forth to identify competencies required to be a professional wetland practitioner. Easy, right? Well, it took about a year and a half of regular meetings during which the time and scope expanded from just defining the competencies to discussing roles and responsibilities of the government, the professional organizations, and the professionals themselves. So, roles and responsibilities. There were a lot of discussions about how to create the standards, and it was quickly recognized that there were multiple levels of responsibilities in the area of wetland practice. The standards included responsibilities of the government, the professional organizations or the pros, and the authenticating wetland practitioner themselves. The government's responsible for creating and implementing directives and tools, as well as ensuring that these are adaptively managed, including revisiting them every 5 years from the date of the publication. Each pro ensures that their members understand these new standards and appropriately apply their stamp and signature. And the authenticators need to understand how their professional ethics and standards apply to the regulatory applications under the Water Act, the Wetland Policy Stream. This includes knowing when they need to authenticate documents and how to self-evaluate their competencies and those of their team. Okay, so there's 4 key authentication points. And we're also going to put up a poll now about authentication and how often you guys attending have had a chance to authenticate. The standards identify 4 documents that require authentication: the Wetland Assessment and Impact Report, or WARE, the Wetland Design or Plan, Wetland Validation Report, the Wetland Verification Report. The latter 3 relate to mitigation, but also to the Wetland Replacement Program. The first one comes into play to get a Water Act approval. There are other documents that request authentication now, such as Water Act applications, approval amendments, notifications, and things like that. So an update to the standards will likely be needed at some point to capture these. Okay, Alberta authenticating wetland practitioner requirements. So the way the standards were set up, they attempted to stack the requirements. So it means that there's layers to becoming an authenticator. So starting with being a member of a pro, followed by 5 years practicing as a professional member, 3 of which must be practicing wetland science, engineering, and design. Then the final layer is competencies applied to one's professional practice as it relates to the wetland policy implementation. And these competencies were itemized in Appendix C, which we'll talk about a little bit more. Okay, so this is what Appendix C looks like. It's a competency table, and once we're done this authentication poll, we're going to add another poll to ask about your skill sets, where you fit in all this. So the competencies were itemized per directive or task, so you can see that here in the table as column headings. Within each task or column, there was competencies that were grouped based on knowledge areas and skill. So for example, you can see in the little blow up there that for identification and delineation, the authenticator or their team must have wetland vegetation identification and taxonomy skills. Okay. Yeah, and then we'll be adding a poll here where it asks you if you're a member of one of the pros right now yourselves.
Sorry, Amy, we're just a little bit behind in the polls. We've just done 1 poll thus far. So
we'll catch up on the polls later.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you want me to continue running them then?
Sure. Yeah. You can catch up on them. I don't think. All right. So we'll just talk a little about the professional practice in Alberta. So the wetland professional practice standards built upon what unifies all professionals, which is that all the professional organizations are regulated by the government of Alberta, who allows these organizations to regulate the practice of their members. The professional legislation defines the right to practice, as well as three main regulatory mechanisms, which are continuing professional development, disciplinary procedures and discipline options, as well as the minimum education and experience. So how the standard unifies these professional practices. So the government mandates these three requirements, but the specifics of that are further defined in the organization's bylaws, whereas the Wetland Professional Practice Standard provides standards across the organizations. The specifications in the wetland practice standards are far more detailed than any profession or professional organization's bylaws. So this kind of reaches across all three to keep it consistent. And then another aspect of this is another layer of protection for the public, the organization, or the proponents of development. The standards identify the need for professional insurance. So the insurance functions by protecting the authenticator legally, and when following the professional practice standard, it also protects the authenticator professionally. All right, so that's a whole lot of background to get through, but you can re-watch the video later if it's a bit fast, but we want to spend lots of time getting into our panel discussion. So our panel consists of 4 of the 10 members of the Competency Advisory Group, or the authors of the practice standards. And I encourage you to visit our webinar webpage and just check out the panelists' biographies. You can access their contact information, there's downloads and links of interest. So we're going to go through all the questions one at a time. We're going to ask all the panelists. We're going to start with Marcus, then Tom, then Noel, then Lori, and we'll kind of go in order. While we're doing that, you can add your questions into the chat window, and we'll probably have a couple more polls pop up while we're kind of going through these and get caught up on the polls. So we'll start with the first questions. Okay, so starting with Marcus, what are the documents that you have authenticated?
Thanks, Amy. I've authenticated wetland assessment impact reports on a very regular basis for the past 8 or 9 years, 8 years probably, since 2015, when the directives and guides were published that support the new wetland policy, quote unquote. So most of my authentication has been on these reports, but I've also authenticated or acted as an authenticating wetland professional for wetland assessment impact forms, which is a different document that supports water applications. And since 2015, 2016, I've probably authenticated close to 100 water applications for various governments across the various clients across the province. So those are the 2 primary ones. And I'm getting to some of the other ones now with some additional different projects, but mostly it's wares and waves for me.
Okay, Tom?
Well, most of my wetland experience was prior to the formation of the committee, and I haven't done any professional work since then. So, or at least as far as wetland projects are concerned. My current experience with it is that the house that I'm talking to you from is part of a plot of land that was covered by the wetland policy, was properly planned, and the developer paid the fee for replacement at another site. The town of Cochrane is surrounded by morainal material and knob and kettle topography, so it's a big issue in our jurisdiction.
Okay, Noel?
Good afternoon, everyone. I work primarily in Category 1, which is the wetland assessment impact reports. I've authenticated a few of those, but I've also worked a lot in another area, which is the reclamation process. And I have authenticated or signed off on many reclamation apps.
And Lori?
Yeah, so I have done wetland assessment and impact reports and forms, but I've also co-signed off on wetland restoration construction design. And by that I mean usually when you do that, you have an actual concept design, a grading plan. Like, it's not a simple one singular design. You have to go through processes. So what's the concept? Then what is the grading plan? What is your reclamation plan? And then in some cases, what's the construction plan? So these are all normally signed off by engineers. But, you know, if you're including those drawings into that design report, that's what I signed off on. To date, I haven't signed off on any validation reports.
Okay, we'll move on to the next question. What does authentication mean in your organization? We'll start with you, Marcus.
Thanks. Authentication to me means taking responsibility for the content of the regulatory application. As we heard in the presentation up front here by Amy, wetland work is multidisciplinary in nature, and I'm aware personally of very, very few people that could confidently say, and probably correctly say, that they are confident in all these different disciplines that are listed in the appendix of the practice standards. So typically, probably what applies to most of us is that we are confident in a subset of those competencies, and so the other competency areas need to be covered by somebody else. From my personal experience, like, I can do some basic soils work, but I wouldn't be confident enough to take responsibility for my soils work towards a water application. So then I work with other people that are much more experienced and educated in that area, in those different disciplines that I'm not really confident in. Let them take the responsibility, but I pick them to be part of the project because I know them and I've sort of vetted them for their abilities and skills and competencies in those different disciplines that I can't cover myself. So ultimately, when I put my stamp or signature on a WHERE or a WAVE document, I take responsibility for everything that's in that report, even if it was written by somebody else.
Okay, Tom, how about you? What does authentication mean in your organization?
There's an authentication standard which is available to the public through the APEGA website. But what it means in our organization is that you have performed technical work and the document that you're authenticating contains that professional work, that you were competent to have carried it out, and that you had the necessary experience and education to be able to do what you said you're doing. The third element is that it must be fit for purpose. And a good example of that was the team of the Pro 10 when they created the joint practice standard. As luck would have it, we were in the process of updating the authentication standard in APEGA, and therefore those were the views that I brought to the table. I was also deeply involved in the authentication standard, so I took the commentary and the discussions that we had around the wetland table back to APEGA, and they had some influence on the current state of the authentication standard. This is a team effort, so APEGA, as well as authentication, as a professional practice standard for relying on the work by others. The work of the Pro 10 was a classic example of that. None of us had a great deal of competence in everybody else's fields, but we worked together as a team and we all understood what our roles were and what our areas of competence were at the time. So I think that pretty well describes how APEGA goes about business. First, that it's technical work. Second, that you take a responsibility for it. Third is that it is the document you're signing is fit for purpose. And that pretty well sums up, I think, what sums up in a long rambling discussion that Marcus just told you about.
Okay, Thanks, Tom. Noel, how about you? What does authentication mean in your organization?
Well, I guess currently I'm not in an organization, but the last one I was in, definitely wanted to ensure that the quality was there. One of the commitments you make when you sign off on an application, whether it's a Water Act or any other type of application, you're ensuring that the information is correct and accurate, and you're validating the quality of the work on behalf of your organization. So it's not a trivial thing to sign off on any kind of application, and definitely the wetland applications fall in that category.
Okay. How about you, Lori?
Yeah, I have a little bit of a twist on it. And this came out of one of the discussions we had, like Amy mentioned, sorry, on the intro, there's layers of what is required by an authenticating wetland professional. So it's not just sign off. It's also having insurance. and so how I interpret this is that the authentication ensures that due diligence was followed, that we followed the professional practice standards, we followed the directives. Not that everything in it is correct, to be honest. Because if you are incorrect, but you follow due diligence, you're still following your professional practice standard. And the fact that you have errors and omissions insurance is what compensates for if we are incorrect. And so I perceive it a little differently, and as such. So and one of the challenges is like, who's on my team, right? Like the people that answered, they have no idea how many times their name has been applied to authentication. I suspect they don't know who their team is, possibly. But also when I'm doing it, if I'm working with an engineer, I'm not like, okay, I need a complete CV from you. And like, so I hire an engineer that seems to be qualified to doing what they're doing, and they've done it before. And so that, that's my team member, but then I do all the processes required of me. I rationalize where I deviate. And so the due diligence is there. It can be repeated. Whatever I do can be repeated, is repeatable from a scientific standard, but it's not necessarily right. And then, and so that's an engineering thing, is you need to be so right, because it's people's lives at stake. Whereas like the more environmental thing in my mind is like, we don't know a lot of stuff. We just simply don't. We do the best. We come to the best conclusions we can, given the knowledge that we have at the time. So there's always a chance to be wrong. And that should not scare you if you've done the right process. So that a little bit of a Lori twist on that interpretation. But yes, authentication is that I followed due diligence, that I have included everything in there that is required of me according to the directives and the standards. And what is different is based on my interpretation of all of the information set before me.
Okay, well, let's jump right into the next question. I think we're all getting ahead into some of the other answers, but there's lots to chat about. So for the next question, we're going to talk about what the difference between an authenticating wetland professional is and a wetland practitioner or a qualified wetland science professional. So, and we can also dive into a little bit about what Lori was talking about, how much errors and omissions insurance is required to be the standard in your profession. So yeah, I'll let the panelists kind of choose if they want to speak to one or the other of those or both. So we'll start with Marcus.
Thanks. I think there's a lot of terminology in this first question here. So authenticating wetland professional, there's a wetland practitioner, and then there's QWSP that's in there as well. And I think a little bit of background is needed to put some context around that. Pre-2013 or 2015 probably, there was this thing called QASE, Qualified Wetland Aquatic Environmental Specialist, that the wetland people called themselves. It's not an official designation. It's something that we just lumped ourselves in as an indication that we are wetland professionals. When the new wetland policy came out, and still call it the new wetland policy, even though it's 10 years old now, when the most recent wetland policy came out and its supporting documents, the guides and directives a couple of years later, the QASE I think was initially replaced by that QWSP, the Qualified Wetland Science Practitioner. That lasted for a year or so, and that was replaced by an interim wetland science practitioner for a little while until these practice standards were finalized and the term authenticating professional was coined. So there's a few iterations of alphabet soup that followed between 2013 and 2017. From my perspective, the authenticating wetland professional are the people that ultimately sign off on water applications. They take the responsibility for the documents, the content in these applications, and would ultimately be responsible in case something was questioned by the regulatory agencies. So EPA or AER in this case. Wetland practitioners could be anybody else who doesn't meet the qualifications or the educational and vocational experiences outlined in the practice standards. So that would be the majority of people doing wetland work would be wetland practitioners. They go out and collect data, but they're working under the supervision of an authenticating professional who would then take the information, vet it, make sure it's correct, put it in the report, and then the AP would put their signature and stamp on that report, even though the information to a large degree likely has been collected by somebody else, mostly wetland practitioners.
Oh, really good, Marcus. Tom, do you want to speak to either of those? And feel free to pass if you want to.
Right. Well, Marcus has pretty well summed things up pretty well. One thing I failed to mention when we were talking about authentication is that all PEGA professionals, licensed professionals, place public safety as the very first criterion of the technical work that they perform. And we are constantly reminding ourselves and each other, which is why we all wear our iron rings and silver rings, and that we take responsibility for the people that work under us and with us on those kinds of jobs. So in most cases, if you have a need of a professional engineer or geoscientist, that person is an authenticating professional. Wetland practitioner, as Marcus described very well, I thought, is anyone who's actually working in the field and reporting to an authenticating professional. And qualified wetland science professional is a term that is defined in the joint practice standard. There are other fields where there are similar kinds of designations under some policy or act of provincial legislatures or federal parliament. One of the critical ones, which this is rather fashioned toward, is just a QP, qualified professional, who does evaluations of mining properties. Largely the same requirements that are under a QW professional, but specific to a purely economic enterprise. And there's a parallel pair of designations for oil and gas work. So the qualified wetland science professional or practitioner or wetland professional all sort of trace their lineage back to that kind of construct. And the reason for that is to ensure that laws are enforced, that people who are conducting work that affect public safety always place that as their first priority. And that's also true of the wetlands policy.
Okay, thanks, Tom. So yeah, Noel, anything, we're trying to catch up a little bit, anything quick you want to add on to what Tom and Marcus have said?
I'll do it real quick. I think the biggest difference in those different designations is responsibility, level of responsibility, and years of experience. And that's a good way to sort of describe them, is that obviously the authenticating wetlands should have the most responsibility and years of experience in order to perform their duties.
Okay, Laurie, you want to add anything on to that before we move on?
Just really quickly, the QUISP was a temporary title, like Marcus said, interim, also temporary. QUIS is still used, and that's really specific to code of practice, I believe. So there's that. I am just a wetland practitioner on some projects, and on others, I'm an authenticating wetland professional. So I don't necessarily see the difference in years of experience. Being the difference, I think it's project specific. And so if I'm hired to sign off on it, then I up my rates. A little bit, actually, because of who I am. I'm just a one-off organization. I'm not some massive conglomerate that has only one rate. But so there's that. So QUISP, not ever in use. And I just want to say AWP op is not a credential, nor is a WP. They are not credentials, they are titles. So just as a side note, sort of get into the meat of it. And nobody really, I answered the errors and omissions insurance. Were you going to go around again with that one, Amy, or do you want to?
Real quick, because we got to move on. If you've got something to say, or we can maybe save it to the end if we got a little more time to talk. So.
Just super quickly, just some main standards that I've worked with is a 2 million for pre-disturbance and 5 million if you're working with engineers. I don't know why, or if you're in an engineering company. Also, your name needs to specifically be mentioned as insured if you're authenticating. So it can't just be your company has E&O insurance. You specifically need to be named in that. And yeah, those are the main two things. So it's different from commercial general liability. Professional liability is something different. Like if you are wrong, but you did it right, you just have to use your insurance and you don't lose your right to practice. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. All right, so the next questions are very similar kind of thread, talking more about the Alberta or the authenticating wetland practitioners requirements. So this gets to something that I think we started to talk about in the slideshow and talked about a little bit more, but the standards don't indicate that the Water Act application or waste require authentication, but in DRAS or One Stop, it does name authenticators. So we'll just go around and have everyone speak to other places in the Water Act process or other processes where authentication is required. So we'll start with Marcus.
Okay. I haven't looked at the standards in quite a while, but I think actually on the first or the second page of the document, it says that authentication is required for applications under the Water Act. It may not specifically speak to a where or a waive, but I think there's a reference in a general term towards regulatory applications under the Water Act. And just to provide some feedback for those that don't know, DRAS and One Stop are the online application platforms of Water Act applications. DRAS is the one that applies to EPA, and One Stop the one applies to AER. So other documents, I'm actually unaware at the early stages of a Water Act application, sort of pre-disturbance, where sign-off for an authenticating professional is required. And as Laurie mentioned a few minutes ago, the validation and verification report certainly would require it. That's at the latter stages of wetland enhancements or restoration projects. I typically, in the past, have been pulled into temporary diversion license applications as a wetland specialist if water was diverted from a wetland under a TDL, but that doesn't technically require authentication by a professional wetland specialist. I was just pulled in as an expert in the field to provide input on those types of applications. So I'm not sure if anything else in the early stages does actually require an AP signature and stamp.
Okay, Tom, how about you? Any to add on to what Marcus has said?
Well, one thing, the Alberta Water Act does not require authentication anywhere, but in many places, I think I counted 30, including the regulations, it requires an engineer's certificate. And nowhere is that very well defined. So we're not sure whether they mean a professional engineer with the professional engineer's stamp, or a professional geoscientist who's reporting perhaps to an authenticating professional engineer. But it is a kind of a problem, and we're hoping that the next iteration of the Water Act clarifies that one requirement. But there's no question, I went through all of those certificates, and they all meet the quality requirements for professional engineers authentication, but nowhere is it mentioned.
Okay. Noel, how about you? Any more to add?
No, I think I'm just going to pass it over to Lori. She might have some more comments.
Yeah, it's like a scope creep. When you're talking to different regulators and they require different things, they also are saying that they require an op to sign off on it. And so I was curious. I've had some people talk to me about, amendments to grading plans, things like that, that they're being required to sign off on as an authenticating wetland professional. And I think it's conflicting because things that are not covered under the professional practice standards are now being thrown into that. And so if we don't know, if they're sort of making it up and it's not written anywhere, I think it opens up some liability if it's not written anywhere and it's being applied differently across Alberta. So I amendments to Water Act applications, WAIF, honestly, the WAIF wasn't even identified in the practice standards. So it just seems that there may be like a list of additional things that may be requiring it if it is to be true. Or else I guess the regulators may find that they're going to get some pushback if they're requiring authentication on documents that aren't described in the practice standards.
Good one. All right, we'll move on to our last set of kind of pre-written questions, and then we'll dive into some audience questions and follow-ups to our discussion here. So these ones are talking about the competency table that's appended to the practice. So, and I think, again, maybe we'll try to have you guys speak to both questions as we kind of go around through everybody. So we'll start with Marcus. What levels of skill are expected in each knowledge area? And of course, you don't need to speak to them all, but just maybe, kind of pick out a couple of your favorites or maybe ones that you find are either unclear or something like that. And then just in general, how do you feel like you prove, or how were people expected to prove that they're competent in a knowledge area? So big questions. We'll throw it over to Marcus first.
Yeah, I'll pick one of the competencies, and that is wetland identification and delineation using air photos, aerial imagery. It's something that is an absolute must-have skill, and it's a skill that is not something that can be picked up very easily. And I always talk with my colleagues about wetland delineation using aerial imagery, that if you give the same image to 10 different wetland practitioners or authenticating professionals even, you'll get 10 different delineations. And even if you send them to the field to do that delineation verification, you're still going to get 10 different delineations of that wetland in the field. So it's a bit of an art and a science to be able to do something like that. So as a wetland practitioner, I would expect that person to be able to identify wetlands on aerial imagery, whether it be Google Earth or an actual air photo. I would expect that person to come up with at least a tentative delineation and classification as well, based on multiple sets of imagery. Then the authenticating professional would take that and apply his or her expertise to that delineation, tentative delineation and classification, and say, yes, we need to adjust the boundaries here a little bit, or the classification is actually different from what you think it is, and here's the reason why. So the authenticating professional would have a deeper understanding of some of the scientific background of wetland ecology, and certainly would have a lot more experience having done that particular task or competency in the past. How do I prove it?
Proving? Yeah, how do you prove it?
How do I prove it? With fieldwork delineation, working with juniors and intermediates very closely, doing fieldwork and desktop assessment work, making sure that they can learn the skill from you, passing on my expertise to others in the field people that want to get established in the field. If I work with somebody that I have never worked with before, like I currently do, I work with them very closely doing field work. They take pictures of everything. They send them to me. I verify the identifications, for example. If they do delineations, we'll share screens to Teams meetings. I vet them through the process of doing wetland work. until I'm comfortable and say, yes, I can trust this person being able to do this job going forward. And I can relax a little bit as opposed to really keeping a very close eye on their progress.
Okay, thanks. Tom, how about you? Do you want to pick on a particular competency or speak to how you prove, or, you know, within your professional organization, how people prove they're competent?
Well, as a member of the Board of Examiners for APEGA, I do have some experience with that experience. Competency consists of three components. The first is education. The second is experience. And the third is the performance of the individual in carrying out their technical work. Of the list in the table, the earth sciences figure prominently, as do the life sciences. And that's where the kinds of competence I just spoke about would be the ones that I would be looking closely at if I were to hire a professional to do some of that kind of work for me. So a person who packs any designation that has the word professional attached to it has been subject to the requirement for a university degree, has been required to go through a period of minimum of 4 years of experience under supervision, and then some period of time after that, 5 years under the wetlands policy, to show that they have a good track record in terms of their professional competence, in particular their performance in the area of specialization. So with that, I'll pass it on.
Okay, great. On to you, Noel.
I guess just listening to Tom and Marcus, they each kind of took a different approach to it. But I'm going to go back to our discussion we had when we actually designed the standards. We had a lot of debate on what level of skill or how many years of experience an individual would require to do the work and be able to sign off. I think at one point we started with 10 years of experience. And then we started realizing that, that was going to eliminate a lot of current practitioners. So we scaled it back to about 5 years, which is what ended up in the standard, that somebody has actually worked in that area for 5 years under supervision, like Tom said. And also, to support that work experience, they would have their professional standard. And by having their professional standard, whether it's a PEng or a PBio, you do have a level of scrutiny and evaluation on how well you perform in that particular area of expertise. So between those two was where we decided was appropriate to be able to do the work. I think in a way, maybe we were a little higher than we should have, because there might be individuals that have that same level of expertise with less years of experience. But I think in most cases, that's probably an appropriate level. And we're also relying on other organizations, the professional organizations, to help verify whether those individuals truly are competent and have that appropriate skill level. So that's a different way of looking at it versus I guess Tom and to a certain extent Marcus. But
okay, and over to you, Lori. Just some things to add in before we jump into some participant questions.
Sure, I'll try to be quick. So I recall when we were doing this, we talked about knowing that skill set exists, having a working knowledge of it, having a senior level knowledge of it, and having a specialist knowledge of it. And if I am signing off on an engineer's design of a grading plan, do I need to know how to create a grading plan, right? Or do I just need to know that here's what soil exists and here's how they want to move it around, right? So what level do I need to know if I'm signing off on a design per se? And so, I have a working knowledge of it. I'm not a specialist. I can't do one, but I will sign off on one, right? I will sign off on one if I'm working with somebody that I trust. Now, so there's different levels of skills. And if you're an authenticating professional, you just need to make sure your team, and and I think we discussed this, you need to make sure that it's specialist experience somewhere on your team, right? Or senior level. You need to, as an authenticator, know what level of skill is required. So like if there's no potential for species at risk, do you really need to have that species at risk specialty, right? And then how do you prove that? And to me, that means two things. How do I prove that if I'm in a professional disciplinary hearing, number one, or number two, how do I do it if I'm in a court of law? And so there's a couple of different things there. And so what are the receipts, right? So education, here's my certificate, here's my transcripts, proof. And like Tom said, those are standard to becoming a professional. But at any rate, like here's my transcripts that show how many, wetland related courses I have. So it's up to me to be able to translate biology 301 into, component, translate that into wetland. How does that apply? Or any continuing competency that you do. Maybe it doesn't have the word wetlands in the title, but you need to be able to prove in some way. So for continuing competency, I keep all the digital stuff. If there's a PowerPoint presentation, I keep it in a file folder, and I keep a spreadsheet of it. And so I have all of my receipts. You pay for a course, you get a certificate of completion. How do you know that you have the skill sets? How many years experience is enough? Is there anything that you can refer to? For example, Veg ID, right? Where is Veg ID needed? Veg ID for identification and delineation, but also ABRET, classification, things like that. Reclamation, you need to know your plants. You need to know, what they're thinking. So basically, where would I go? Do I need rare plant level experience? Well, I know that's a place to start. So I know that there's rare plant survey guidelines. So within there's a list of what competencies are required. Within that, that's 2 years, 2 years of full-time field work, getting trained with somebody. So how do I prove it? What proof? Well, it's different things that are required, but annually, like I don't have to put I just do an updated CV and my continuing competency program for both ASA and ASPB, right? And that's what's similar, and that's what Noel was saying, is these are Anton, like you get your education, your experience, and your performance. And so I've just found ways in which I can prove to anyone that I'm qualified, because I know how to take my education, experience, and performance and create the narrative that proves that I am a specialist.
Okay, so yeah, documenting when you can, and as a professional, there's a lot of annual things that we have to do anyways. So yeah, it's not easy, but I think, you use what you can. All right, well, we're going to jump into some audience questions, so don't be shy. I feel like, these panelists are extremely knowledgeable, and that's maybe slightly intimidating. But, don't be shy to kind of ask questions that you think might be too simple, because I bet other people have the same questions. So I think we'll have any of the panelists just kind of dive in on these questions, and we're just kind of start right in. So one of the questions we had is, can an agrologist sign off? Anyone want to lead us off on that one?
Sure, I'll start. An agrologist, so a professional agrologist, a PAG, would belong to the AIA, the Alberta Institute of Agrologists, to which I don't belong. I'm a PBIL. But I guess clearly, yes, the AIA has processes in place that require you to identify your areas of specialty, and wetlands is one of them. And certainly AIA or PAGs can certainly sign off on regulatory applications under the Water Act as well. And I would venture a guess that along with the biologists, they're probably the two largest professional societies that do that in the province.
Yeah, no, that definitely seemed to be the feedback. Okay, here's a bit more of a meaty question, and I think probably start up a lot of discussion among the panelists. So, are the regulators required to have any competencies to provide SIRs, to issue authorizations? Do they require to be authenticating wetland professionals? And And maybe your thoughts on this. Should they not? Should they be separate? So yeah, we'll just let anybody who wants to dive in on that one.
Marcus, you going to go on that one first?
Sure, I'll start. I know for a fact that the regulators at EPA's and AER side don't necessarily have to be authenticating professionals to issue SIRs in regards to water applications. And I know several cases where that is actually happening. So not all of them do. I'm sure some of them do have the qualifications to be an AP as well, but some of them don't. Should they be required to be APs? Probably not necessarily, as long as they have access to necessary expertise within their office to ask other people whether something makes sense in a water application, like a wear or a wave or not, that they can lean just like us writing these reports on other people for assistance. So they may not necessarily have to be APs themselves, but they should have access to expertise to cover some areas that they aren't comfortable with.
Okay, this next one I'm going to put right to Tom because it's kind of a follow-up on something he was mentioning earlier. So ideally, how would you like a, qualified wetland professional or an authenticating wetland professional to be incorporated in the regulations? So you're kind of mentioning, it talks about engineers within the Water Act. Do you think those should be replaced with an authenticating wetland practitioner, which, of course, could include an engineer or, specify maybe an engineer that is a authenticator. So, Tom, your thoughts on that? How would it ideally be in the regulations? According to
that's one that I was put a lot of thought into. So
yeah.
Thanks for asking the question. First of all, yes, I think really there should be some definition in regulations that require which level of professional does what and what kind of interaction there should be or obliged to be amongst experts in different elements of the same problem. Wetlands are particularly subject to that, and I think that when the time comes for first of all, revisions to the Joint Practice Standard, but also revisions to the Lands Act and the Water Act come up for consideration. It would be nice to know, speaking as one who has had to confront it a few times, what qualifies as a certificate, and if I've got all the necessary competencies to sign off on a Water Act certificate, but I'm not an engineer, is a professional geoscientist good enough? And we've had to work around that problem a number of times. So it specifically asks for an engineer, therefore it must be signed off by an engineer, which means even if that engineer has no competence in geoscience, he has the obligation to consult somebody who does, and that's basically where I come in.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I know we could say a lot more on that. I'm going to try and squeeze in one, maybe two more questions. Are there any organizations or employers that you guys are aware of that are really good at providing on-the-job training for a developing wetland practitioner? Is there any group where you think is like the perfect, somebody wants to learn, become a practitioner? What's a great company or organization or group of people where, they're going to get that mentorship? Anybody want to weigh in on that real quick?
Sure, I'll chime in and get the process started. I'm semi-retired now. I work for my own company, but I've worked for 3 other consultants before that over the last 15 years. As a senior ecologist, wetland specialist, I always saw it as my responsibility to mentor junior staff and intermediate staff. And I've done that in all 3 of my previous positions. And I think that if you really are looking for some guidance, some mentorship, I would imagine you would get that probably in many, especially if there's some of the larger consulting firms out there. Just have to enter into some kind of a mentorship agreement or some program and get started from there. So I've seen that as my responsibility as a senior. But I think that most larger firms will have something in place that allows you to become more proficient in your wetland work.
Okay, thanks, Marcus. And just one last question. We'll try to do a real quick response to this. It's around the 5 years that we kind of touched on. So it's a little confusing where, do they want somebody that's had 5 years of experience as a, say, for instance, P-Bio, or is it okay if they're an agrologist in training or a biologist in training? Does that count into the 5 years? So yeah, maybe a real quick answer, and then we'll kind of wrap everything up. So.
Well, I guess I can try that one. I think from my memory anyway, we resolved the 5-year point in time because some organizations take longer than others in order to get have their members become professional status. And that's why the 5 years kind of covered off every organization that was involved as far as getting their professional status. I don't think it's a magic time period, but it's sort of became an average time period for us to include in the standard. There might be some point in time when that's reevaluated, and maybe the time changes in the future. It's up to the regulators to realize whether they think somebody with less years of experience or maybe more years of experience, depending on what's happened over the last 6 or 7 years.
Okay, well, thanks. Doesn't hardly feel like enough time to talk. Sorry, Lori, you want to jump in and say something real quick?
Yeah, I think there's still a bit of confusion, actually. And I remember there was when we discussed it. So all of the organizations don't have the same amount of years that you need to be articling or in training. And this 5 years starts after you become a professional member. So the clock is at 0. And the reason for that is the thought was that it's more important that you understand the impacts to your profession rather than knowing all of the ins and outs of the discipline. And by that, it means like you could lose your right to practice if you don't follow due diligence, if you don't hire the right team, if you ignore information, or if you fudge reply. So, the 5 years, it was found that it was more important to have more experience as a professional than as a wetland practitioner. That's why it's 5 years after becoming a professional, 3 years of which must be practicing wetland science and engineering and design. And that's my memory of it. And I believe that's on that.
Okay, well, hopefully that answers people's questions on that. So that wraps up our time, unfortunately, and hopefully this provides you all with a little bit better understanding of the wetland practice standards. And thank you so much to everybody for participating. Don't forget to check out the webinar webpage. We're going to plan to update it with the recording, and the link was sent in the chat. There's also going to be other links from the webinar included on the website. And just a note to anybody that signed up, you're automatically signed up for Somtech's monthly Connector newsletter, which is a list of learning opportunities across a bunch of different organizations in Western Canada. But if you don't wish to receive it, there's an unsubscribe button at the bottom and on the website. And last but not least, I want to thank very much our esteemed panelists for sharing their time and their knowledge today. I feel like we could have talked 3 more hours and the time and effort that all of the authors put in for years creating these standards. So thank you very much to those guys. I just wanted to also say that if you're looking to add some knowledge to your competencies, you can check out some of our seminars that are coming up early in 2024. And there's a little sneak peek on Somtech's 2024 season. We offer company-wide discounts, so you can check out information on that or on grants on the ABRET A course page. So thank you so much to everyone. I know we're at time. Panelists, if you want to get one last word in, now's your chance before everyone signs off.
Oh, thanks for inviting me to participate in the panel. It's much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amy.
Thank you.
Thanks to you all.
Okay.